Well, good morning, everyone. And the first thing I would just like to say is good morning and welcome to the closing session. And what a better day to, today I call this an inside day. So what better place to be right here in front of your computer and having this closing session. Today we're excited to have Dr. Bob Holsworth here to analyze the recent elections and their impact on Virginia. But before I turn it over to Bob, I'd like to say a few words recognizing our veterans and those serving in the military as we observe Veterans Day. I went to a funeral last Friday. Her name is Rachel Parker, and she was from Bedford County. And she had two brothers who died on the beaches of Normandy. And you know, it really struck me. I guess y'all heard of the Bedford Boys. And she lost two brothers within 35 minutes. And I know I was there at her funeral with tears in my eyes with her, but also with the sacrifice that family had gone through back in that day. And it really struck me hard, and struck my heart very deeply. But I'd like to thank all for their service, and no matter which branch you served in, whatever your job or how many years you wore the uniform, your commitment to service in the military is and was a brave and selfish act. Thank you again to every veteran with us today, and thank you to those who continue to serve today so America can sleep peacefully at night, and God bless you. Now it's time to discuss the past election, which perhaps was one of the most anticipated presidential elections in history. I think a lot of us was glad it was over. But Dr. Bob Holsworth is no stranger to our annual conference. This is the fourth time Bob has spoken at our annual conference in the past 10 years. We picked another exciting year to bring him back. Bob is one of the leading political analysts in Virginia. His comments on Virginia and national politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and newspapers throughout the nation. The author of 5 books and numerous articles on public policy and American politics. He was the founding director of both the Center of Public Policy and the Wilder School of Government and the Public Affairs at DCU. Bob is currently a managing principal in Decide Smart. That's a firm that provides analysis and planning assistance to agencies, local governments, nonprofits, and private sector companies with governmental interests. Bob received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So let's give Bob a good, warm, virtual welcome. And Bob, I'll leave the floor to you, and I'm muting myself, brother. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with everybody today. And what I'd like to do really are 3 things. First, talk about the presidential election in terms of where we are and where we're likely to go. Secondly, to talk about what happened here in Virginia on Election Day. And then third, to talk about the implications of this election and other events going forward in 2021 here in the Commonwealth. So let me begin with the presidential election. Right now, as I look at it, certainly that the media has called Joe Biden the president-elect. The president, Donald Trump, has yet to accept the results as portrayed by the media, and is largely saying that he has won the election. And if he hasn't, it's because of fraud, and he's engaged in a set of legal challenges to the election. My sense is that these legal challenges are going to be difficult to pull off at the end of the day for a couple of reasons. First, let's just take a look at where we are in the Electoral College right now. If we look at the situation that happened in 2016, Donald Trump won because he won the so-called blue wall in the upper Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic. He won in Pennsylvania, he won in Michigan, and he won in Wisconsin. And so for Joe Biden to win, he had to, in some ways, repair that Democratic blue wall. And it seems to me that he has, and that it's going to be difficult to overturn the election in those states. In terms of Michigan, Joe Biden has won by about 3%, almost 150,000 votes. In terms of Pennsylvania, he's up about 45,000 votes, and that's likely to get larger by the time they finish counting all their votes. And in Wisconsin, he's up 20,000 votes, and there's going to be a recount in Wisconsin. Recounts very, very rarely get over, get to the 20,000 mark. So my sense is that in terms of the count, he's likely to be ahead. The only question there sometimes is, will the states certify the elections? In both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, those elections are certified without the approval of the legislature. In Pennsylvania, it'll be the Secretary of State, who's a Democrat, and the governor. In Wisconsin, it's the person who controls the election, the Secretary of State. Michigan does have that kind of approval process through the legislature, though that would be very difficult, I think, to change, given that the margin in Michigan right now is closer to 150,000 votes. So my sense is that Biden certainly has a clear lead and likely to remain that. There are two other states that are really outstanding right now. That's Arizona and Georgia. In Georgia, Joe Biden has a lead that's about 12,000 votes, growing a little bit. That is likely to have a recount. But again, 12,000 votes is normally more than we see in a recount. I think Biden is ahead by a similar margin right now in Arizona. They are still counting votes. I can't tell for certain what's going to happen with this count, but if the count actually is, if it's accurate what they're saying about the ballots that are missing still, that haven't been counted, it's unlikely that Biden's lead would totally dissipate. Arizona has a much stringent recount criteria. It's 1/10 of 1%. So if Joe Biden wins by more than 1/10 of 1%, he's likely to carry Arizona as well, barring the legal challenges. And at least at the moment, I haven't seen evidence in the legal challenges that look like the kind of evidence that overturns an election. So it appears that Joe Biden is likely to be elected president. I've never quite seen the situation where someone, hasn't conceded. We'll have to see how that plays out. I hope that whatever happens, this plays out in a relatively, in a way that's peaceful, and that we don't wind up agitating in the streets on both sides, because that could be very problematic for American democracy. So I'm just hoping that we wind up with some kind of result for the election that the vast majority of people accept. In terms of what happened here, if we look at the reasons for this, and I would say that this election is a little different than 2016, that much different. Joe Biden has certainly won more votes than Hillary Clinton did. He's likely to win by a little over 5 million votes in the popular vote. She won by about over 3 million. And the Electoral College has shifted. But again, if you take a look at Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these shifts, particularly Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these shifts were relatively small. You're talking about 40,000 votes in Wisconsin, 90,000 votes in Pennsylvania. So what seems to have happened is that Joe Biden and Donald Trump both generated huge turnouts, which is good for democracy. And Biden was able to turn out Democrats in some of the Democratic areas that they didn't turn out a little better than they did in 2016. And he also cut into Donald Trump's margin in some of the places that Donald Trump carried by a smaller amount. He didn't cut in by a large amount, but in Pennsylvania, where there were counties that Donald Trump won by 63% last time, he now won them by 61.5%. And those small margins eventually added up to the difference as well in Pennsylvania. The other thing I want to mention is that we saw very much the same kind of divide in this country that we have seen growing for the last 8 or 12 years. And that is, if you take a look at the urban metropolitan areas, the larger ones in particular, they shifted, or they remain heavily Democratic, with the exception of places where we saw Donald Trump cut in, particularly to the Latino vote, such as in South Florida. But by and large, what we're seeing is that the highly prosperous metropolitan areas, Metro Atlanta, Metro Philadelphia, really went for the Democrats, whereas in rural America, Donald Trump did probably just as well in many instances, in some instances better, in some instances a little worse, but by and large ran up huge margins in rural America. So basically a few changes in this election. I think the suburban areas that abandoned Trump ultimately proved decisive, along with Biden being able to generate significant turnout among Democratic base communities, particularly in the African American community there. So let's turn to Virginia as well. And what happened in Virginia, I think, if we look at this election, is that it really put a punctuation point on the trends that we have been seeing in Virginia for many years. And these trends are not very different than what we've seen throughout the country. The difference in Virginia is twofold, is that we are more metropolitan than rural, and that we have a large part of our state, part of the Commonwealth, that is located right next to DC. So what we saw in Virginia was this: just like the nation, in the more rural parts of the state, with the exception of Southside communities where there are significant African American populations, but in the more rural parts of the state overall, we saw Donald Trump run up huge margins. You look in places like Tazewell, Smith, and Southwest, he's up to 75, 80%. Throughout the state, in the rural areas, Donald Trump ran up very, very large margins. And I'm going to turn that phone off for sure. Ran up very large margins. And it's not very different than we've seen in every other election. If you take a look at the numerical jurisdictions in Virginia, Donald Trump won more jurisdictions than Joe Biden. Joe Biden happened to win, however, almost all of the large population areas. I think the places where Republicans had their highest margin of votes this time, in terms of total votes, not percentage, was Bedford County, where Donald Trump ran up, I think, a 24,000 vote margin. Did very well in Campbell County as well. But what we see is that in the more populous parts of the state, in the metro areas, particularly on the eastern side of the state and central, Joe Biden ran up huge, huge numbers, just like we saw nationally. So in Fairfax County right now, I think I looked this morning, and I think the total vote is about 250,000 vote margin for Joe Biden. And so what you see is, when you see that kind of margin, very, very difficult to overcome. City of Richmond, for example, is almost the exact reverse of the rural areas, where you saw Donald Trump getting 75, 80% of the vote in the rural areas. In the city of Richmond, Joe Biden gets 80%. And that's the same. And then beyond that, in some of the suburban areas that at one time had been heavily Republican, in this election, they went Democratic. Chesterfield County went Democratic by about 5 points. Virginia Beach City went Democratic by about 5 points. And so again, you saw this divide that we've seen throughout the nation manifest itself in Virginia. Indeed, I would say that this divide is even exacerbated in Virginia by the fact that President Trump has a message that works well in many other states, but does not work well in the most populous part of our Commonwealth. When he talks about draining the swamp in Washington, that's often seen as a direct assault on Northern Virginia in this ways. And I jokingly say sometimes that I don't know if the swamp's been drained in Washington, but Northern Virginia has been drained of Republicans. If you take a look at the representation in the General Assembly, I don't believe there's a single Republican who represents any piece of Fairfax County. And I think there's one Republican who represents part of Prince William County. So that's the situation that we see in Virginia right now, very divided politically. And if you take a look at the State Board website, one thing that you could look at that's really fascinating is to try to see how many jurisdictions actually had a vote less than 60% one way or the other. The vast majority of Virginia jurisdictions are 65, 70% jurisdictions one way or the other. The rural areas being for Trump, the metro areas, the cities being for Biden, and then you have some suburban areas that are still what I would say would be purple, that had Biden with a small lead, like Virginia Beach, Chesterfield. But in other places, such as Henrico, Fairfax, Prince William, they're not even purple any longer. They're clearly blue. So that is the situation in Virginia. And the same thing happened at the senatorial race with Mark Warner and Daniel Gade. Biden won by about 10 in Virginia. Warner wins by about 12. And it's the same story that we saw with the presidential race. Very similar story to that we saw with the gubernatorial race in 2017. And so, as I said, what happened in these statewide races in Virginia is that there was just a punctuation mark put on the trends that we've been seeing for quite some time. And it represents the challenge that the Republicans have in statewide races. Since 2005, in races for governor, senator, president, the Virginia Republican Party has won one election, Bob McDonnell in 2009. And so the party faces the challenge of trying to find candidates that can both appeal in what you might call the more Trumpian parts of Virginia, the rural areas, and at the same time have enough appeal in the metro and the suburban areas to cobble together a majority. And the Republicans have really struggled to do that since 2005, with the exception of Bob McDonnell, who ran a very practical campaign focused on jobs, transportation, kind of issues that impact people on a day-to-day level there. I should note that this is not an impossible task for a party, and I'll get back to this later in my comments, that in 3 of the bluest states in the country, there are Republican governors. In Maryland with Larry Hogan, in Vermont, and then in Massachusetts with Charlie Baker, all very Democratic states, all with popular Republican governors. But they have a stance that's somewhat different than you've seen so far in some of the people recently nominated by the Virginia Republican Party. So that's the challenge for the Republican Party going forward. And as I said, the statewide race has certainly put a punctuation mark on this. Turning to the congressional races in Virginia, we wind up really with the status quo. We started off with 7 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and we're going to wind up with 7 Democrats and 4 Republicans there. The Republicans had hoped to knock off 2 Democrats, in particular Elaine Luria in the Virginia Beach area, and Abigail Spanberger with a district that runs from RVA in the Chesterfield and Henrico in the Richmond area, all the way up through Culpeper outside of Northern Virginia. And Elaine Luria, in a rematch with Scott Taylor, won relatively handily. I think Taylor was still hampered by the lingering impacts of the election scandal that had occurred and had damaged his candidacy a few years ago when members of his staff had been involved in an effort to put fraudulent signatures on signature sheets for a third-party candidate that they hoped could siphon votes away from Luria. Taylor still wound up trying to explain that, and in saying that he had nothing to do with it, just his staff members. But in elections, if you're still explaining, you're usually losing. And Luria did a good job of replaying the 2018 race. The closest race was this race in the 7th district with Abigail Spanberger and Nick Freitas. If you take a look at this, this is the district that Donald Trump carried by 6 points in 2016. So the Republicans thought they really had a good shot at doing this, because if Trump carries this district by 5 points or 4 points, there's not a lot of ticket splitting that goes on these days. If you look at the Spanberger commercials, she ran as if she was not sort of just a Democrat. Those of you in that viewing area heard her talk all the time about how she worked across the aisle. She didn't care about red Democrats or Republicans. She just cared about the national interest. But when you take a look at that result, those results, they mirror very much the presidential race. And what happened there is that Joe Biden eked out a victory over Donald Trump in the 7th congressional district. He won, I think, by about 1,000 votes or a little more than that. And Abigail Spanberger ran better than Biden, but only by 300 votes. So for most of that evening, Spanberger was behind. But when the absentee ballots, the mail-in ballots came in from Spotsylvania and Henrico, she extended her lead and kept her seat. You might have seen that Spanberger thereafter went up to D.C. and in the first meeting of the Democratic caucus was very upset, said that the Democrats' national policies almost cost her the election, because what you saw was that the Democrats, while they looked like they've beaten President Trump, did not do well in the Senate races as well as they hoped in the Senate races and the congressional races. The Democrats had hoped, they thought they would take the Senate. And in fact, you probably heard them speak about they were going to, whether or not they're going to pack the Supreme Court, but everything was premised on the assumption they were going to carry the Senate. And right now, the Republicans are ahead, and the Senate's going to come down to these 2 runoff races in Georgia. And typically, the Democrats don't do as well in runoff races in Georgia. They've lost 7 of the last 8 there. So Mitch McConnell has the lead, and he just needs to win one of those runoff races to keep it. In the congressional races, the Democrats, though they're going to pick up 15 or 20 seats, they're losing seats. They're losing between 5 and 10 seats in the Congress. And that's what annoyed Abigail Spanberger. What she said is that the left-wing orientation of the Democrats, that the complacency, they thought they were winning when they were talking about the Green New Deal or defunding the police. She said that's almost cost some people their election and almost cost me mine. And so you have this little controversy, or probably not so little, brewing inside the Democratic Party between the more moderate Democrats and the more progressive Democrats about what trend to take. But in any case, Spanberger was able to hold on. The third race that received a lot of attention in Virginia was between Bob Good in the 5th and Cameron Webb, a Democrat that from UVA, a very attractive candidate. The Democrats thought had a chance after the Republicans dumped their incumbent Denver Riggleman in a nomination battle, picked Bob Good, and Bob Good wound up winning that race. And again, you have to take a look at the presidential race. Donald Trump carried that district by about 70,000 votes. Bob Good carried it by about 40,000. So Cameron Webb did well in that he reduced Trump's margin by 30,000 in the congressional race, but that wasn't enough to win in a district that's quite conservative in its orientation. So maybe he will try again in 2022. but at least running in a presidential year where not that many people are splitting their tickets became a task that Webb, even with a financial advantage, couldn't overcome there. The third election in Virginia that made a lot of had a lot of interest was the redistricting amendment, and that amendment passed in Virginia to change the manner in which we do redistricting. It changed to produce what we call a bipartisan commission that will be composed of 8 legislators and 8 citizen members that are tasked now with drawing the redistricting maps. Let me talk a little bit about that. Was not surprised that it passed at all, because whenever that the citizens across the country have been given the opportunity to participate, to vote on a plan to participate in the redistricting process, these plans almost inevitably pass on that front. And in Virginia, it passed overwhelmingly, I think basically by a 2-to-1 margin here. So not all surprising at that. If there's anything surprising, it was sort of the politics that preceded it. That in some ways, for years, the Democratic Party throughout the previous decade has called for some form of independent or bipartisan redistricting. And the Republicans opposed it at every turn. And they did so because at that time, they had a 2-to-1 majority in the House of Delegates. They controlled the Senate, and they were unwilling to give up that power. The Democrats said, you know, we should forget about power and we should produce good government. Then in 2019, the Democrats were elected to the majority in both the House and the Senate in the Virginia General Assembly. So the question became, would the Democrats still have their commitment to good government, or would they be somewhat hypocritical and give up this power and try to keep the power and not support the constitutional amendment that they had supported previously there. Interestingly enough, the Democratic Party was split, and interestingly enough, the Republican Party changed positions. All the Republicans who had been against it for the last decade, all of a sudden thought this was a marvelous idea, and the Democrats were split. Some Democrats said, you know, we can't be hypocrites. We got to go along with this. It's still good government. And other Democrats said, you know, this is just terrible. You know, why would we do this? And ultimately, that split was good enough to ensure that the constitutional amendment passed the legislature for the second time, was put on the ballot for the public, and the public endorsed it. What I can say is about politically is that you know, I don't know of any political party actually that has ever, after being out of power for the first time in a generation, as a first step, comes into power and gives up one of the biggest powers that they might have had, concedes that. And so you could look at this as sort of virtuous by the Democrats, but I think they were actually put in this position by what they had advocated for 10 years. And they really couldn't go back to the electorate and say, you know, we're absolutely total, complete hypocrites on this. In terms of the, in terms of what this means, that's an interesting question. So, in terms of the exact, you know, composition, as I said, it's going to be 4 legislators, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 2 from the Senate, 2 from the House in each party. And then there are going to be 8 citizen members chosen by a panel of judges from a pool that the parties have provided. So there's actually, it's not an independent commission, because I don't think there's any criterion that actually requires an independent on this commission, but it is a bipartisan commission. And then secondly, the commission has a supermajority requirement. In order to pass a map, you need the approval of 6 of the 8 legislators and 6 of the 8 citizen members there. And the idea behind that, sort of the good government idea behind that, is that what that will lead to is that will lead to bipartisanship, because these maps cannot be passed by a single party. Both parties are going to have to agree to pass the map. I would just tell you that that challenge is substantial to get to actually to do that. In 2011, I had the privilege of chairing a bipartisan advisory commission on redistricting that Governor McDonnell formed. It was only an advisory commission, didn't have any power, but we had 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. I was the independent chair of that commission. And we produced maps that I think were clearly better than the maps that the legislature produced. They were more compact. People could understand who their legislators were. They weren't totally gerrymandered maps. They were much better than the existing system. But we produced more than one map actually because we couldn't agree on a single map. Even on an advisory commission, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans couldn't agree. And I didn't want to be in the position of being sort of a tie-breaking vote on one side or the other. So what we did was that we just produced more than one map to show the public that it was possible to do a better job than the Assembly was doing. But it told me how difficult it is to reach a consensus on the maps. So when we think about this commission and what it's likely to produce, if it produces an agreement, my guess is that it's an agreement that's actually going to be fairly status quo. It'll be an agreement that will protect both sides' existing status, because largely that's what they're likely to agree to. Other than that, they won't reach an agreement. And if they don't reach an agreement, what happens is that the map drawing is then booted over to the Virginia Supreme Court, who in all likelihood would pick a election law specialist from the legal community or political science to draw the maps. So my thinking is that at the end of the day, this is a better system than the current one, which really stinks and is really terrible. But I don't have that great hope that all of a sudden it's going to usher in this new era of competitive elections and maps that have nothing to do with politics. That's highly unlikely in my regard. Finally, before I take your questions, let me turn to 2021 and talk about what's happening here in Virginia. First and foremost, I think we're still in for the next couple of months till we get the bridge to a vaccine, till we get that vaccine distributed. We're in for a rough time with COVID-19. If you take a look at some of the numbers that I've seen just this morning, I've seen hospitalization numbers that are as high or higher than anything I've seen in the last 3 or 4 months. We're seeing between 7,000 and 10,000 cases a week emerging in Virginia. Those numbers could actually go up. So I think all of us are still going to be struggling, both at the local level and the state level, with the implications of the virus for the next 6 months, probably, until we can get a vaccine that's widely distributed there. Secondly, when we take a look at upcoming elections and where we are in Virginia, 2021 is another election year right away, that as soon as the votes were counted in 2020, the 2021 election started in Virginia. Those of us who are political pundits love this because it's our full employment policy that we have an election every year. But the fact of the matter is that this is already started in high gear. In fact, there are over 30 people who have said that they're interested in running for statewide office. So it's actually going to be a different kind of year. On the Democratic side, typically what you have is that if you have the lieutenant governor and you have the attorney general, one of them is going to be the nominee for governor. And sometimes they fight it out in a nomination battle. Sometimes they reach an agreement beforehand about who's going to run. This time, as they did last time with Mark Herring stepping aside and Ralph Northam running. This time, interestingly enough, neither of those people are either running or the favorite. Mark Herring has decided to run again for attorney general. Justin Fairfax is running for governor, but given the allegations that have bedeviled him for a number of years now about sexual assault, he certainly isn't the favorite. So what are we likely to see? My sense is that Terry McAuliffe, as of 8 o'clock this morning, has yet to announce, but I can't imagine that he's not announcing. He has said that he is not running, not in the running for a position in the Biden administration. And that means I think he's running for governor in Virginia. He had raised a ton of money. He was the governor who left office probably more popular than when he came in. He has support across the Democratic Party. He's going to be a very strong candidate. But fascinatingly, other Democrats are not getting out of the race. Jennifer McClellan, state senator from the Richmond area, she's in the race. She is very well liked by many Democrats. There are many Democrats who believe that it's time to elect a woman Democrat as governor, and they think McAuliffe, for all that he did, should step aside. And then Jennifer Carroll Foy, delegate from Prince William, she's running as well as the progressive alternative to the Democrat, to Terry McAuliffe and Jen McClellan, though McClellan's trying to kind of clearly straddle that side. But what you're seeing in the Democratic Party emerging is not only an unusual primary race, but what you're seeing is the Democratic Party trying to negotiate its own divisions in much the way they're trying to do this on the they're trying to do this on much the way that you're seeing on the national level. That what Carol Foy will argue is that McAuliffe has been too beholden to corporate interests, and that it's time for a more progressive alternative. And so traditionally in Virginia, successful Democrats at the statewide level have run on kind of a platform that has been very, what I would call socially progressive, liberal on a lot of social issues, but moderate on and pro-business on economic development and economic issues. That's Terry McAuliffe, it's Ralph Northam, it's Mark Warner. That's the kind of formula the Democrats have had for success. But what you saw in the last legislative session, emerging particularly, I think, out of Northern Virginia, is a more progressive element in the Democratic Party, talking about unionization of local government employees, raising minimum wage statewide, talking about perhaps project labor agreements, criminal justice reform, extensive gun safety legislation. And so what you're seeing is a more energetic, progressive side of the Democratic Party. And as they go forward, that is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge the Democrats have, is to keep the party united as these ideological divisions are revealed and exposed. Dick Saslaw, for example, most powerful Democrat in the Senate, barely hung on in a Democratic primary in 2019, and probably only kept his seat because he had two opponents rather than one. So that's what we see on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, what we're seeing is something a little different. We see Amanda Chase out of Chesterfield County running, and she's sort of the heroine, you might say, of the Second Amendment sanctuary movement. She's sort of the leader of that, one of the leaders of that movement, is going to try to run as a mini Trump inside the Republican Party, sort of basically looking at herself as a leader of that side. There are many Republicans in the business community who find this to be something they can't possibly win, running that way. So Kirk Cox, another former Speaker of the House from Chesterfield, he's running, hoping to run as sort of a more business-oriented Republican who's going to run on the argument that Democrats are going too far on taxes, they're going too far on criminal justice reform, threatening public safety, and the like. Plus, there are a set of other Republicans who are getting ready to run, including business people and maybe former member of the Assembly, Carrico, may be running. But by and large, the question for the Republicans is, can they find that candidate that can transcend the urban, the metropolitan rural divisions that are really killing them right now? So that's where we are ultimately in Virginia. It's been a remarkable year nationally. We're still not out of the woods on the presidential election, I think. I'm just hoping that as we go forward, we find a solution that really results in some peaceful answers to everything. Virginia, I think, stayed where it was politically. And in 2021, the Republicans are hoping that if Joe Biden is the president, they really have a chance at, making a serious run at the governorship for the first time in a number of years. So that's where we are. I'd love to take some questions and comments from everyone.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Bob Holsworth. I appreciate your comments and your point of views, and very interesting. And we would like to take a few questions, maybe 10 minutes here. So one of them, I think from King William County, Ed Morin. Can you unmute yourself and ask Bob your question? Ed.
Dr. Holsworth, Ed Morin, supervisor with King William County. Listening to your comments, I've always wondered if a state could conceptually develop our own electoral college to offset the dominance of and Southeast Virginia, Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach. Is that even possible? Conceptually, of course.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at Nebraska and Maine. They've done that, right? That both Nebraska and Maine divide their electoral college votes. Donald Trump won one vote in Maine, even though he lost the state. And Joe Biden won one electoral college vote in Nebraska, even though he lost the state. So the legislators would certainly have to do that. I actually thought there was kind of a movement in some states where Republicans controlled the legislature to do that more frequently. And I thought if it was going to be done, it would have been done during the McDonnell years. But Bob McDonnell never expressed any real serious interest in it. And so now that if you have, a Democratic governor and Democrats in the legislature, that's going nowhere. But certainly it could be done. Not many states do that, but you could do it that way. What happens? I get a lot of questions the other way, where people ask me, can you change the electoral college? Because what you're seeing is that the Democrats have won 7 of the 8 popular votes in the last presidential election, but they have not won 7 of the last 8 elections. And that's not going to change because many of the small states would never agree to that. And so there's an effort to have a workaround where states would actually agree that they would cast their electoral college votes for whoever won the popular vote. So you wouldn't actually have a constitutional amendment, but you would have some kind of gentle person's agreement. There's a number of states that have actually agreed to that. But I'm not sure how legal that would be or how constitutional that would be if it happened. And I often tell people when they say that certainly with Republican state legislators, the likely outcome is more in the other direction, is the one that you mentioned, where you might take the Maine and Nebraska version. But I haven't seen any impetus for that in Virginia.
Very interesting. Thank you, sir.
All right. Trying to go through this in order if I can, and I missed someone, and I apologize. Debbie Donahue, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Debbie.
I'm the supervisor from Rappahannock County, Wakefield District. Dr. Holsworth, I am wondering how the citizens will be selected for this commission.
Yeah, my sense is that there's a twofold process here. Ultimately, there are some, I think they're retired judges, I could be wrong, that make the final selection, but they do so from a list that has been provided by the parties per se. So I would have preferred just the retired justices doing that, because maybe you would have found people who are independent. But my concern is that this is just going to wind up being 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, after 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans on the legislative side. And I'd really like to see if we could generate some independence of thought on that commission, because I think that could be very, very helpful. I think it's important that this commission works pretty well and doesn't become a disaster right away. And so what I do know is that whoever is appointed will take their responsibilities very seriously. I was really impressed when I did the Independent Advisory Commission with Bob McDonnell. We had no power, and people came, and for 3 months, people devoted an incredible amount of their time to trying to make this commission work. So I think that you're going to see a lot of energy out of the citizen members. I think the retired justices will try to appoint people who they believe have broad, thoughtful perspectives and aren't just knee-jerk partisans. And I'm hoping that happens. I'm not absolutely confident that it will.
Okay, another one up there, Billy Geiger. Introduce yourself if you would, Billy.
Yeah, I'm Bill Kiger from Rockingham County, where we're very red in many ways. But one of the questions I just heard on the news this morning that the Vice President of the United States has just announced that he has canceled his upcoming vacation plans. Is there anything into that we should read?
Oh, he's canceling the vacation plans in order to, get involved in the, the controversies in the election on behalf of the president and himself, obviously, in this front. And that's the question that's going on about, how serious is this? How far is it going to go? So there's this one perspective that basically says, well, the president's just sort of positioning himself for whatever happens next. At some point, he's going to be, he's going to leave. I heard Bob Woodward the other night on one of these stations saying there's just a lot of stray voltage out here, and don't worry too much about this. On the other hand, when you have the president saying what he is saying, when you have the attorney general asking prosecutors to look for election fraud, when you have the kind of involvement, I don't think this is ending anytime soon. It doesn't appear to me that that's necessarily the case. We've seen the campaign manager say the president might start holding rallies again. And if that happens, we could be in for even more division. So, this is a very divided country. My sense is that almost all Democrats think this is just ridiculous. Just end this thing. Hillary Clinton didn't call for recounts and protests and all of this after she lost. And at the same time, I would believe that a significant portion of the president's supporters believe that somehow there must have been something untoward or illegal that happened in this election, and that it ought to be examined in great depth. And so, normally we think that elections solve issues, that they end them, at least temporarily. I'm not sure this is, so we'll have to see what happens. But I'm more skeptical, I think, that this ends in the next week or so than some of the people who are out there saying that it obviously will on that front.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Holsworth. We maybe got time for maybe 2 more questions. We kind of got to wrap this up. I got Jason Bellows is next on the agenda on the question. Jason.
Thank you, Dr. Holsworth, for that insightful presentation. Jason Bellows, Lancaster County. My question was, what do you see as the past partisan gerrymandering playing in the role of the extreme partisan divisions we see today? And it seems to me that we'd all be better off for good governance if we basically use computers to draw every district basically as 50-50 as possible.
Yeah. Okay. So let me explain. First, let me say Lancaster County was one of the almost close to 50-50 counties that we had in Virginia. I think it was like 51-47, and that's unusual, actually, that we have that. Certainly partisan gerrymandering has had a tremendous impact on things. The challenge in using computers to draw lines that are 50-50 and competitive is that would require significant gerrymandering itself. Because the challenge is not just how they draw the lines. The challenge is within us. We're not 50-50. You could redraw the lines in Southwest Virginia, for example, right now. In any way you try, you're gonna have trouble getting 50-50 in that sense, because by and large, the people, by kind of where they live, their lifestyle, and they're like tend to one direction. The same might be true of Eastern Northern Virginia. That that's going to tend, at least in the Democratic direction right now. So what's happened is that we've kind of sorted ourselves out politically by our beliefs, by our lifestyle, by our education level. So people in my business often talk about whether you live in a Whole Foods county or a Cracker Barrel county, to try to talk about things. So I think nonpartisan gerrymandering could make things better, but I don't think it solves the issue of the divisions that are really related, to very strong feelings that people have about different beliefs that are related to their belief system and to what has happened to them experientially in terms of their life possibilities and whatever. And so I would prefer bipartisan or I really prefer nonpartisan redistricting, where we would have certain kinds of data that would be presented to people that would try to make districts more competitive if possible. However, I think there are even limits to that based on how people have sorted themselves out by their place of residence, their lifestyle, and their cultural beliefs.
Thank you, Dr. Holsworth. I was hoping to get one more question in with Mike Turner, but I think we're running out of time here. So, Bob, I hope that maybe we can make it a fifth time you come back to VACO, and we appreciate you coming and giving your insight. Political insight is very precious to us, and we think we consider you part of our VACO family over the years for coming to us. So let's give Bob a big virtual applause if we could. Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right.